Well, without further ado, we are going to get this lunchtime event underway, given that it is the lunch hour. My name is Randy Mason, and I'm the faculty director of the Center for the Preservation of Civil Rights Sites here in Philadelphia at the University of Pennsylvania, Weitzman School of Design. We are very grateful for those of you who have joined us for the next in our series of dialogue events, where we talk with practitioners and scholars whose work we learn a lot from, and whose work inspires us. And today we're very grateful to have Ángel David Nieves, professor from Northeastern University, who's agreed to join us to talk about a bunch of different things that he has worked on over the last several years. That literally has been an inspiration to me because we've known each other for a while now. And so I wanted to just lay out at the beginning the general schedule for the afternoon. Ángel and I will ask questions and have a dialogue back and forth for 40 minutes or so, give or take. And after that, we will use the balance of the hour to entertain questions or comments from those of you watching from your desks or from your homes. So we do hope to have it be more open dialogue near to the end. Before we get to the content of the day, I did want to give a more proper introduction to my distinguished colleague. Dr. Nieves is a professor at Northeastern University and a professor of, I have to take a breath, Africana Studies, History, Digital Humanities, and English, and the Director of Public Humanities, and all of which speaks to the breadth and the intersectionality of all of his work, going back to when we knew each other at University of Maryland a number of years ago. Before arriving at Northeastern, Professor Nieves was appointed at San Diego State as a professor in a number of different fields. And before that, an associate professor at Hamilton College. His scholarship, as you'll hear about in a moment, relates to African-American histories, also important work in the history of South Africa and apartheid in South Africa. Much of which has been really beautifully and powerfully presented as digital humanities work. And that will be a substantial part of our discussion today. Dr. Nieves has been a real pathbreaker in the areas in using digital humanities to address African-American and other important and undertold histories. For that work, he's gotten support from some of the biggest and most important foundations and public agencies around, including the Mellon Foundation and the National Endowment of Humanities and other places beside. So with that relatively clipped version of your lengthy introduction or bio and resume, I wanted to welcome you, Ángel, to this virtual living room discussion. So good afternoon and welcome.
Thanks so much, Randy. This is such a great opportunity for me to meet back up with you, and of course to get this opportunity to talk about the important work you've also been doing there at UPenn at the Weitzman School, and have an opportunity to really talk about our mutual interests and passions around the preservation of these important histories that have been neglected for too often, and to have a chance to talk about the kind of work that we do, the stuff that we live and breathe every day. So I'm so grateful for this opportunity to get a chance to talk with you again, and so grateful you in many ways gave me a start to the work that I'm so passionate about. So it's nice to have this opportunity to speak with you again.
Great, thank you. So I have turned a fresh page in my notebook as I go back to school, and first wanted to ask you in the first part of our discussion about your historical scholarship, and without kind of overplaying it, I think that's the historical scholarship and the lessons that one learns from archives and about the absences and the silences and the erasures in our field's current understanding of heritage. I think that often is what motivates us to enter into these fields and to stay in them, even though our work might verge into other directions and other methods. So first wanted to talk about your historical work whether your two excellent books, the Architecture of Education, complete with post-its and annotations all over it, as well as the earlier collection, We Shall Independent Be, very elegantly titled, edited collection. Those are both great educations in themselves. If you could just talk for a minute about the kinds of stories that you saw the opportunity to tell through your own long work on the monograph, but also in organizing other scholars' work in the We Shall Independent Be, sorry.
No, that's it's a mouthful on that collection title. I think one of the reasons I've pursued the work in large part has been because of the long silences that we've witnessed in our particular fields and in the areas in which we both work, and in part I think the silences have always been around the work of African American women reformers in particular, and I would say those women coming out of enslavement and their work to try to uplift the race, as is said during that particular period, and their work really was in part not just to uplift their race, but the kind of work that they did across racial lines and ethnic groups to really empower generations of folks who had been disempowered. And the ways in which they worked was often so brilliant in that they brought together different kinds of people to really reform America and to build up a new nation. And in so many different ways, historians, architects, planners had really overlooked their particular contributions because, they didn't have the sort of official pedigree of being architects and designers, but they were very much doing the work of design and designers, albeit, maybe not with that official sort of imprimatur of the profession. And much like African Americans of the period, African American men who were also doing that work. And so it's been an interesting sort of journey to try to see how African American women who were reformers were so particularly invested in the built environment and were often writing about the built environment as much as they were being activists in the built environment. And so they used what I like to call the power of the pen in so many different kinds of ways to not only write about what they felt was necessary to better the race, but to also enact and to change the physical environment to make a place for themselves, just a couple of generations, a couple of decades after slavery. So it was really a lot about trying to uncover these narratives that were there and had been sort of overlooked in the archive, and to really find in the narratives of the 1880s and 1890s that space was such an important part of how they talked about the schools, churches, and organizations that they helped to found, and that space was really a key component of that. So the built environment was something that they often included in so much of their discussions about what needed to be reformed, but for some reason, I think it just was kind of passed over, and instead they were just seen as reformers, and that kind of spatial history just wasn't considered. And to me, as someone who has always sort of thought about space in spatialized kind of ways, it was just glaring, and I felt it needed to be talked about. So I felt that was really something that we needed to understand as a profession, and to see it in tandem with the work of early Black architects, of early Jewish architects. And it really sort of brought out the importance of the 1890s as this kind of pivotal moment in the reform work that was going on in so many different ways in American cities.
And one could say the same thing, or I think included in your overall story of Black women preservationists who didn't fly under the banner of capital P preservationists, but absolutely were motivated and animated and successful in implementing preservation outside of the increasing acknowledgement of preservation as a professional field or as a reform movement first, as you pointed out. We share a great love for the 1890s, I know. So I think that, as you cast it more broadly as a study of the built environment, and indeed, I think that's a very important lesson for everyone in historic preservation to always be thinking twice about, is that it's always the creation of environments, whether that includes a strong measure of inheritance or a stronger measure of creating new places. I think there are, it's preservation by different stripes. Your book, Architecture of Education, dwelled a lot on the institutions of the time, and recently HBCUs. There's a greater awareness of HBCUs' contributions and their importance. How does that feel 10 years after you'd kind of written your story? Do you feel a connection to the ascendance of people's awareness of HBCUs, although they've been doing this important work for a very long time with less people aware?
Yeah, it's been amazing to see the transformation of the kind of attention that's been paid now to HBCUs. They've been so important to the preservation, I mean, literally and figuratively, of African-American culture. And they've been such hallmarks to the way in which African-Americans have been able to build up this Black nation. And in the book, I try to talk about them as the real cornerstones for being those places where African-Americans could express themselves, could promote their particular cultural heritage. And I say cultural heritage really writ large, in sort of new forms of cultural heritage and preserving other forms of earlier cultural heritage, but then also really beginning to push for a kind of Black architectural profession in a way, but also in the preservation, as we saw in early kinds of forms of preservation. But to see the ascendancy of HBCUs today, because they were also the places where the archives of African-American history were most being well preserved and maintained, but to see them now being the places where we are seeing resources and support being poured into them in a way to help them continue that important legacy has been just transformational. I mean, when I was doing early work as a graduate student in places like Tuskegee, in places like Hampton, they weren't necessarily receiving the kind of support that they should have. And they were really bootstrapping a lot of their resources to do that work and maintain those archives. And now getting that particular attention has meant a transformational move forward, and has really meant that people are now paying a lot of attention to them and really partnering, as UPenn is, with a place like Tuskegee to do this important work in a way I think that really changes the script for understanding their contributions and what they've been able to maintain a bit under the radar in ways that now deserve much more attention and deserve a lot more credit for maintaining the cultural heritage of African Americans.
Indeed, our work simply would not be possible without the partnership of Tuskegee, and the partnership with Tuskegee, of course, stands on decades and decades and generations of work. And I see that my colleague Kwesi Daniels is in the room, so to speak. So I hope that he has a comment or a question later on, being the chair of architecture there and our principal partner. The feedback that you've gotten on the book, the monograph has been out for 5 years or so now, the other book for considerably longer. Are you still getting lots of feedback about or more feedback, given the kind of greater awareness of the importance of these narratives today, or in any kind of feedback on the feedback that you want to give about how your work's being received?
I think one of the things that's been interesting about the feedback I've gotten is it's gotten a lot more press, so to speak, or reviews out of UK journals and sort of out of UK scholars as opposed to scholars in the US. I think there's a lot more realization, I think, about the importance of, or the realization that the built environment is or goes so in tandem with reform work in ways that hasn't necessarily been the same in US circles. I think it's taken a little bit longer to sort of see the work of, particularly of women reformers of the period, as those contributing to space, contributing to sort of the built environment. I think now more and more is sort of coming out, and I think it's being seen a little bit better in terms of, or I shouldn't say better, but a little bit more realized with the Black Lives Matter movement. I think that's helped in a lot of ways to see that the built environment is very much a part and parcel of what happens when we have broad social movements, and sort of tying social movements to the built environment is kind of a no-brainer now. It's seen sort of as something that has been happening and needs to be happening. And so it's beginning to get a little bit more buzz. I think one of the things that has happened. It's been another victim of COVID at the particular time that it probably would have picked up or been a lot more, recognized. COVID sort of hit, and to be honest, I think because it was with lesser known press, it didn't get the kind of audience that it probably might have had. But I've been, so grateful to work with University of Rochester Press, and they have such a great African series in general, a well-recognized series, and they've been such a great publisher to work with, and it did so relatively well as a softback book. As a hardback book, they went to softcover, so it made it a little bit easier to access. So I'm sort of proud in that regard. So it had a 2020 release. So hopefully it'll continue to sort of rise and get picked up even more. Maybe this will help.
Great. So yeah, we'll have a rash of Russian sales of the books, and maybe you'll tell us if there's a film in the works if you decide to go Hollywood.
Yeah.
Well, one last question along those lines about your historical work. You may be working on other. I know that you, as I mentioned before, that your work has also more recently focused on South Africa and obviously in digital humanities, which we'll talk about in a moment. If you are continuing your work on built environment reformers, African American reformers in the South or elsewhere, or if there's kind of work that you would like to see done, or what do you think are the kind of the next raft of narratives and stories and research tasks that grow out of your work and the other folks that you've worked with, obviously.
Yeah. Thanks for that. One of the newer areas that I've started doing some work in, and it grows out of this work, and it's funny how one's scholarship always is cyclical in so many different ways. And one of the areas that I've started looking at in particular is now trying to understand, and it grows out of this work, and one never knows how little kernels of ideas start to sort of resurface. But the work of these early African American women reformers was often, or at least it was attempted to be impeded by white mob violence early on. These schools often suffered at the hands of arson in many regards. So, these were simple structures often made out of wood. And so they were often victim to these arsons and burned down by early sort of KKK gangs and mobs. And so I've started working with our Civil Rights and Restorative Justice Project at Northeastern, and they've been, thanks to the work of Judge Margaret Burnham, they've been documenting over 1,000 lynchings cases between the 1930s and the 1950s, and they've been building this massive archive of these cases, and then doing reparative work with survivors, family members, to try to bring back some sort of dignity and restitution, and doing the work of really making clear that many of these cases, and in fact, almost all of these cases, had very little or nothing to do with any crimes committed on the parts of the victims. And one of the things that I found in starting to do some of this work and just beginning to look at some of these cases is that in most instances, the violence that was committed against African Americans, men and women, was actually about wanting to seize or steal property and take land away from African Americans. And as an African Americanist, it never really it was something that I didn't really understand about the cases. And so I started to really look into this, and it became clear that there needed to be another sort of level of work in trying to understand lynchings. And we needed to do something about trying to understand and documenting the sort of land seizure and land basically being stolen, and that there were extra legal means that were being sort of put into place where these properties were being stolen and taken, and that we needed to find a way to document this, but then to also also find a way through spatial history and through some of the 3D technologies that I've been using over the years to try to also bring some of that work to court cases, to try to bring restitution and bring back, what is owed to the families that essentially, were forcibly removed, left fleeing in many cases, never came back to that property and actually still own much of that property. And so we're sort of in the midst of trying to figure out not only how to represent the property that's been stolen, but to also figure out a reparative sort of framework for trying to bring restitution to the families. And there's another important piece to this is we're also trying to figure out generationally the kind of damage that was done to these families over time, but also the kind of damage that was done to the broader community generationally and also institutionally, and finding ways to document that visually. Using the work of digital humanities to represent that. So we're really trying to push on the boundaries of GIS and 3D technologies to help us try to visualize that information and to really represent the kind of damage that was done generationally, institutionally, over the long haul. And so we've been trying to figure out ways to do that. And we're at the very beginnings of that kind of work, but I'm blessed to work with some amazing graduate students at Northeastern who are really helping me. And they're so collaborative and from so many various fields, from sociology to English to history, and I'm able to draw on their interests and their expertise, and also a cadre of folks. And we've been working through a unit I've been developing called the Social Justice Studio that sort of brings together librarians, technologists, artists, in this kind of interdisciplinary way, the sort of transdisciplinary way to do this work. And so we're really rolling up our sleeves, trying to figure out how to do this and sort of push the boundaries on the technology in ways that we've already been doing in some of the work that I've done in South Africa. But it's interesting how I'm sort of returning in some ways to that early work on African Americans trying to build institutions and then finding ways to build community, but then the kinds of acts of destruction and that they've had to sort of deal with during that particular period, and then taking that forward into latter parts of the 20th century. But now really trying to find ways to confront that in reparative ways. And, I have done a lot of that work in South Africa and actually a little bit of that work in Germany with Holocaust victims, actually. And so it's been interesting how you return to certain kinds of areas and certain kinds of topics. So it's been fascinating to sort of be in a cyclical kind of pattern with research. You sort of come back to certain things in interesting ways. But again, it's always about trying to find ways to repair the damage that's been done by the state or by other agents and to really help people, close out the loop on damage that's been done to them and to bring about positive change in their lives.
I think that could not be a more important connection to make between historical scholarship and the practice and implementations based on it, history into heritage, and particularly in taking advantage of this moment of greater support for truly reparative action. That's, I think, your work. Many people are, and I'm sure will be, looking to your work. And it's great to hear about the connections that you're seeing between what you've done in different places along these lines. Kwesi Daniels in the chat has raised made a couple of notes specific to Tuskegee and the particular projects that you've mentioned. And I want to come back to those in a moment, Kwesi, if you can stay on the line. But I did want to acknowledge that a pivot that you made that I wanted to go back to and dwell on for a moment, from historical scholarship into digital humanities. And you already spoke to how you're designing these and creating partnerships around these, and being very intentional in making this work go beyond the classroom, beyond the studio, even beyond the university, and to be put to purpose in communities. That is, I think, now a consensus a matter of consensus, and why the digital humanities exist and what they're useful for, what they're designed for. This kind of outward-facing, implementation-focused, and partnership-based way of working. I would like to ask you if you could just kind first dwell on your transition or your pivot. Not a transition, I guess, because you're not giving up anything. You're casting your arms more broadly around more things. How do you think about your pivot into digital humanities as an extension of scholarship?
Sure. Great question. In a lot of ways, I think I have to blame my training as an architect for that. I think has a lot to do with collaboration in the design studio and finding more ways to work across the design charrette board in ways that BOARD, not BORED. Finding ways to collaborate is really what is the hallmark of digital humanities, and I think also understanding that I can't be the expert on everything, and that I have a certain level of expertise about certain areas, and that I really need to rely on the expertise of my colleagues in order to do the work in a way that really does justice to what the ultimate goals are, and that if we bring together the expertise of a number of different colleagues, we can actually sort of broaden our arms even wider and actually do better by the kinds of end products we're trying to accomplish and the kinds of, in a lot of ways, services we're almost trying to provide. And I see us in many ways as trying to provide a service through the digital humanities, not just in trying to answer questions, but also to provide a way forward in almost a kind of client model is the way I sort of see the work of the digital humanities. And so I say it has a lot to do with my sort of architecture background and the preservation work that I've done that's been very practice-based, that it has to have some tangible results. And so I think in widening my arms, I've always felt that I have to sort of provide a way for not just community members to be a part of this, not just my sort of technical expertise colleagues who sort of bring their knowledge to the table, but also the many different kinds of experts that come to any kind of project. So it's been in part a way for me to do better by the kinds of projects and questions that we're asking, because I can't possibly know all the answers. And I think it has a lot to do with trying to bring together students and to train students in a way that shows them that collaboration is really the only way forward if we're trying to truly get at the sort of messy questions that don't often have the cleanest of answers, and that there are lots of roads that sort of go in different directions, that you need to sort of have a lot of different thinkers at the table in order to get at those messy kinds of answers, and maybe even messier kinds of solutions to try to figure out what might be possible. And that there isn't, necessarily a question, and there isn't necessarily an answer, but there are ways forward.
It's also where you get professors appointed in 4 different departments and running an institute and a lab simultaneously. It's kind of, we don't have the right terminology and governance structure in universities to deal with it, which is, navel gazing, which I'll stop immediately. I wanted to ask you kind of an opposite question of that. And this hasn't come up in our previous conversations, but I'm sure that's something that you and your teams have given a lot of thought to. Do you have worries about the questions of equitable access to digital technology, whether it's the infrastructure of, kind of user end access, or the access to things like, coding and, free software and things like that universities, have an embarrassment of riches on?
It's if there's nothing else that keeps me up at night, and there's a lot that keeps me up at night, that's the access question is what really troubles me the most, because I know so much of what I'm trying to do relies on the need for infrastructure and also the need for electricity. And in some of the contexts, and I know it sounds crazy to say, but in some of the contexts that I work in on the African continent, electricity is a huge problem, and I often say to my students, if we're working in East Africa, and I've worked in Tanzania and in other places, when there are rolling blackouts, how do you sort of do any of the work that you do then if it's all supposed to be computer based? What's the solution? And if you even think, and I'll be quite honest, I've worked in parts of the Deep South where things are still quite challenging when it comes to access to a whole host of technologies and a whole host of just all sorts of social services, let's say. How do you then ameliorate some of those immediate needs over fancy gadgets and fancy technology? How do you find that and how do you prioritize? These are the kinds of questions I ask myself all the time. And how do you find a middle ground there when you want to do what's right and with a particular community that you're working with, and when you see yourself in service of a community, how do you prioritize their particular needs before the needs of preservation and before the needs of what you see as important? You've got to take a back seat and figure out how that happens, right?
Do you find that, sorry to interrupt, do you find that foundations and funders are willing to rethink their models in terms of, what are the priorities?
It's been an interesting pivot, having worked with several big funders, and the pivot is happening, and it's happening in a big way. And I think one of the big changes has been in the shift to what's now being termed a co-curation, a co-creation in terms of the work. And it's no longer actually that the institutions, that the universities, that those of us who have been sort of at the top of the pyramid are the ones in charge. Actually, the shift has been, and it's been quite vocal now, that we are sort of at the lower part of the pyramid, and we are now responsible for trying to figure out how do we empower the communities in ways that put them at the top of the pyramid, and how to put them in charge of these processes that we're working with them to help figure out. So there's been a big shift, and the foundations are really trying to figure out how to do better by these communities, by these Black and brown communities that have been disempowered for so long. And there's a lot of head scratching going on and a lot of refiguring. I mean, I've even said, by the very ways in which just the resources are parceled out in terms of how the money's distributed, that needs to be rethought, from the very ways in which the checks are cut. Sorry to be crass here, but just how the checks are cut needs to be rethought as a very basic thing. That begins to change the dynamics, and the institutions, the foundations are really starting to puzzle over this. And I think there's a real difference happening, and will be happening, continuing to happening, and it's happening fast. And I think it's a good thing. And I'm really excited about it. I'm really excited about the change. It surely puts us in a different footing, and means we have to be even more agile than we've ever been before about how we see ourselves and what our role is. And I think it's a good shift. I think it's a great shift.
Indeed. And I know we both have benefited from the Mellon Foundation support, and I think we need to in turn repay that support by supporting them in their trying to change the model of all these very practical and political factors that you're bringing up. So I wanted to ask just one more twist on the digital humanities questions, and then get to some. There've been some questions and comments in the chat as well. So collaboration. This builds on your most recent publication, which a co-edited book on access and digital humanities, and based on that collaboration, you've already spoken about that as an important aspect in a couple different dimensions, both sort of within your team and across different kinds of expertise. You and I are not going to do any coding. I think it's reasonable to say anytime soon, or be programming GIS, but we have other roles to play. So that's one aspect of collaboration. The other is the more fraught collaboration between universities and communities, or universities and other organizations that are typically under-resourced and have less access to things like foundation funds. Looking into the future, how does digital humanities inhabit that difficult space of needing to do more collaboration of more kinds, and how does that look, and how does that look particularly from a project leader's perspective such as your own?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think what's going to happen and continue to happen is that we are going to continue to change the ways in which access happens and the way in which we teach the softwares and the ways in which we do the programming. And I think the open source community is going to become far more important to the ways in which we do that. So this proprietary notion around software is going to start to collapse more and more, so that those sorts of paywalls and that kind of niche software is just going to start to really break down and in fact going to start to go away. If we're going to be real about trying to do this community-based work, it's really going to be about changing how we continue to both train and work in partnership with communities, and how they have access to knowledge production when it comes to the making of softwares and the accessibility of software, but also the accessibility to the hardware. And I think it's going to be really important for us to also make sure that the hardware, the prices of hardware continues to go down. And that's going to be really important too. So it's a double sort of fisted problem here that we're going to have to resolve, but we're going to have to rely a lot more on the open source community in ways that we haven't yet done, I think, enough work towards. That's going to make the important change possible. And I also think that for those of us who maybe are in more of a leadership kind of director model role, we need to be better about talking some of the talk of the tech. And I've always said, I may not necessarily be programming, but I sure can have those conversations in an informed kind of way, so that I can help to translate for more people around the table, particularly the subject experts that may not know that tech sort of lingo, but have an important contribution to provide, and that I can be sort of the translator there and be an important part of that process.
Yeah. Well said. I would only riff on that, on what you just said, by adding a hope, or maybe an imperative pointed at myself and others among us to make universities work more like open source software works, which was supposed to have been accelerated by online learning and simply hasn't. So that's for another day, perhaps. Yeah. So there have been a couple of really good and important questions and comments in the chat. So I would like to shift to that, if you don't mind.
Great.
And I honestly don't know if, Angel, if you can read them as well, or if I can. So I wanted, Kwesi Daniels from Tuskegee University, Professor Daniels had made a couple of comments early on specifically about Tuskegee and your connection to through your scholarship to valorizing Tuskegee's history in the space of Black-led institutions, doing education and advocacy around the built environment. And of his comments, the question I wanted to kind of repose is, can you elaborate more on how you're using GIS and modeling to tell the narratives that you're telling through digital humanities? Maybe get a little bit into the weeds on the technical side for a moment.
Sure. One of the things we're trying to do in particular, and it's one of the challenges with using GIS, is that eventually, and me and my students and I tend to talk about it as the problem of the dot, because GIS is always about sort of finding a reference point that one can sort of model. That GIS is reliant on sort of a point in space. And so what we're trying to actually do is figure out how we can, in fact, get more data out of that one point and actually find a way to annotate a single point in a way that gives us more information than just that single sort of point in time, or that sort of spatial point. And so, for example, when we're doing our sort of spreadsheets, we're actually going beyond the information of just, let's say, an address or where someone happens to live. We're actually trying to find a way to deeply annotate particular points. And so one of the things that I've developed in one of the publishing platforms that I'm working with, and this is the Scalar platform that USC has developed, and we've actually found a way to incorporate GIS within this publishing platform, is we've developed a deep annotation system that allows us to annotate the points of a 3D model and also to annotate GIS in a way that gives us a richer sort of a meaning to those particular points, but then to also incorporate with it primary and secondary source materials so that there's a deep archive attached to those points in both the GIS and in the 3D model. That's just one example. But what we're trying to actually do is take a kind of spatial history language into the GIS in a way that we're trying to break up what we sort of understand as those singular points, the sort of spatial points, to try to get at a much deeper, sort of richer narrative there and do a little bit more of that messy work. And to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out how we're going to do this. So we're actually working with a developer who's developing a kind of plugin for the Esri, and they're actually using this in some of the climate data and sort of climate change that incorporates 3D models with GIS. So it's been an interesting sort of journey to try to push on this tool that they're developing. So there's a little bit of it in the weeds for you.
This I think there's a clear bridge to a next set of questions that have been raised. My colleague Emily Holloway and I have been working on just trying to understand the universe of digital humanities, especially as applied to Black heritage. And I think one of the themes that at least I see emerging is grasping for different means of digital authorship, digital authoring.
Yep.
Beyond what GIS or modeling makes available. To Kwesi's question about, essentially like how do we use what we've got on our desktop right now? That is one side of the question. The other side is how to imagine beyond those and to then create software that presumably that would enable those. But the link was to a question that comments that Thaisa Way from Dumbarton Oaks and Julie McGilvray, our colleague from the National Park Service, were asking about, well, how about landscape or as I would put it, culture landscape as a way to kind of, if you will, like valorize the messiness of the scenes that you're talking about. Could you riff on that for a moment?
Sure. I think cultural landscapes is in fact the best way to sort of think about telling these messy stories. And I think the way in which we've been thinking and we've developed this annotation tool that we're using through Scalar is very much based on sort of the cultural landscape. So being able to think about tagging in this 3D environment with models and with a sort of deeper narrative tool that sort of lets you do the long form in Scalar. The long form narrative is where I think the bridge happens with cultural landscapes. So I do think that that's one place that we've thought about it, and providing that sort of more richer, kind of messier narrative that then also allows the viewer and user both in the 3D world to toggle back into the long form narrative to then be able to also see the primary and secondary source materials that make up part of that archive, allows you to sort of get into a bit of that messiness. I think one of the other things I should have mentioned with my GIS discussion was that we're also trying to figure out how do we visualize power in different kinds of ways? Because GIS doesn't necessarily allow you, and I think the Getty Arches software doesn't necessarily allow you ways to visualize power in different ways. And this came up for us in particular around notions of apartheid, in the different sort of registers in which power happens in a place like South Africa under apartheid. So that for us also came out in trying to figure out how do we describe the different objects that become a part of the archive or that are a part of the archive when it comes to the use of metadata, because the metadata that we sort of have and the metadata that sort of we're bound to by the Library of Congress in many ways doesn't do necessarily the kind of justice we need when it comes to the different kinds of registers around power, when it comes to different kinds of objects and how they're sort of used or seen by different members of society. So it really begins to be a kind of notion of how do we parse out the sort of layers and levels of power, and how does that sort of happen? And I think much of that comes back to this question that we sort of started with around notions of intersectionality.
Mm. The Scalar tool that you mentioned, is that available to experience in any way? And could you provide a link perhaps not to distract everybody by going immediately to follow that link, but maybe at the end of the talk, if you could maybe share with Sarah, maybe we can get it out to everyone. My colleague Sarah Lerner, sorry. So it would be great to be able to literally to visualize some of this exciting kind of problem solving you're talking about. I wanted to next jump to Professor Fallen Aidu's question, which goes back to the power dynamics that we were talking about happening within and between universities and communities and foundations. And she asks, sorry to paraphrase, but just how are you seeing those kind of shifting power relationships and shifting cultures at work in digital humanities? And as she says, how is your work adapting to the dynamics within the partner organizations simultaneously?
Yeah, that's been a particular challenge, largely because of the ways in which many of the partner organizations are still sort of challenged by their infrastructural needs. It goes back to a lot of discussions around the very basic hardware needs and infrastructure needs that the partner organizations have about how can they possibly support communities in the preservation, let's say, of any of the objects and or cultural heritage needs of particular community groups, and how can they possibly train up community groups in ways that respond to the unique needs that they may have, because they, as these cultural heritage organizations, are so used to doing things in a particular way that doesn't always necessarily respond or can respond to the unique needs of each particular community. So right now we're trying to work through a process, and we're working on this planning grant with the Mellon Foundation for this project called Reckonings, where we're trying to develop models for helping community groups work with galleries, libraries, art museums and museums, GLAM organizations, to find a sort of middle place where we can develop toolkits that'll be available online in an analog form, where we can train different kinds of community groups on these different kinds of processes through these kinds of toolkits. So for example, a community group might say, we want to put up heritage markers for African-American heritage sites, but we just don't know how. A GLAM organization may say, well, we have a process by which to do that, but we just haven't been able to sort of translate that into some mechanism by which to do that. So through the Reckonings project, we would work with the organization to develop a toolkit in both analog and digital format that could help a community group do that. And they could then take that toolkit and work through that process. So this is something that we're trying to develop through various organizations that have already sort of done this work, but we also are saying that there are community-based organizations that have done this work that haven't necessarily put that methodology up somewhere, haven't necessarily had the opportunity. So we would like to provide funds and resources to help those organizations do that work as well. So we'll develop the toolkit, put that up online, have a analog format for that, and make that available as a downloadable PDF. So there'll be a place, a kind of resource place, where on both ends of that spectrum, it's possible for organizations to come to that kind of middle place that Reckonings would provide for that, for those kinds of resources to be accessible. So we can move those kinds of things forward. So we've been sort of shopping around different ideas with different organizations, primarily in Boston at the moment, but we've also been looking at other organizations and other community-based organizations that have some of these models in place, and they will get paid, the community organizations, for that knowledge construction that they have, that for that knowledge that they've already put into place, that they've effectuated, and that we can work with them to put into, into analog and digital form. So there's some ways forward, and that I think begins to sort of think very differently about the models for this, and also the ways in which we can think differently about the infrastructure that I think sometimes is some of the challenges faced by some of the more traditional organizations.
Well, we'll look forward very much to seeing the results of that, and I think that would be such a resource to so many partnerships that are either have already formed or wanting to form. I wanted to pivot next to a question from my CPCRS colleague Emily Holloway, and the gist of it is that about how you've negotiated issues around intellectual property stewardship, post-custodial arrangements with partners or research participants. Does this dynamic tend to align with each partner's resource capacity? And presuming so, have you encountered digital humanities projects that have weighed into this?
Yeah, this is always one of the big challenges facing any DH project around intellectual property. And we are essentially saying to many of our organizations that are working with us is that you own the intellectual property around this toolkit. This is your intellectual property, and we are essentially acknowledging that intellectual property. You own that intellectual property, and we are using an instance of that intellectual property to then make this available through, and there are ways to do this through a Creative Commons license that will allow this to be usable online. But the energy and all of the intellectual and knowledge construction that you've made is not something that is going to be taken away from an organization. Is something that you have done, and through a mechanism by which Mellon has allowed us and provided us with the opportunities to, we will be paying those organizations for that knowledge construction for what they've done. And that's been the real difference, that a lot of organizations have never been paid for their knowledge and their work and their time before. And that sort of extraction economy is now going to be sort of turned on its head. And we're going to say, these organizations have knowledge that's worthy. There is a dollar value attached to this, and we're going to pay you for that knowledge. And now we're going to work with you to make that something that's translatable and available to other communities. And yes, there's going to be this commons license that will be a part of this, but essentially you still own that intellectual property as that generative kind of thing that we are then sort of using in this other way. So there's still some challenges there. There are still some push and pull factors. We're still trying to figure out some of those things, and we'd love to have more conversations about that. The IP issues are alive, trust me. Many of our institutions, and I think our own, was still scratching their heads trying to figure out, is this something that we can make some money off of? And I kept saying, we're not making any money off of this. We're breaking that entire model. This is not a money-making venture, nor can it be with the Mellon Foundation. So we have to move away from that entire structure. And so making that clear to our powers that be is often a whole other set of issues that we have to sort of confront and have some difficult conversations sometimes with. But I will say that it was very easy to do with the support of our dean, and our college was all behind it. But definitely interesting, I think, conversations that I didn't get to hear all of. And I'm glad I didn't get to hear all of those other conversations.
Well, someday when you're dean, you'll get to make all those conversations. Sorry to wish that on you. We're almost at an hour, and I want to give you a chance to take a breath, literally, and not to exhaust you for 2 hours. But some of the comments that especially Professor Idu and Professor Daniels and others today have made really seem to raise an opportunity for those of us variously connected to Mellon Foundation or other sympathetic efforts to learn from one another. In not just in kind of ad hoc ways like we're doing this afternoon, but in more purposeful. So maybe we'll have a conversation with Mr. Moore at Mellon and others to see how we can do that, because we have like such a huge learning curve, especially big old privileged institutions like ours. We need a lot of help and a lot of learning to be able to do this better, faster, and more equitably.
Most definitely.
So I just have one last question, and it's a softball. When we spoke last week, one of the things that we wanted to make that I wanted to make sure to come up, you've already mentioned, which was the Digital Humanities project that has grown out of your scholarship and this data set on lynching events then being projected into a reparations-centered project about land ownership and wealth and generational wealth. That's a fantastic connection to make. Are there other projects that you either have, like starting to cook, or maybe just starting as an idea, or something that your colleagues are working on, to kind of inspire us about other kinds of connections that we can be thinking about when it comes to doing historical and preservation scholarship and using the digital humanities as a way to project those better. And that is a very self-serving question for those of us at CPCRS. So this is among the goals that we hold for ourselves as we try to build capacity of our partners and ourselves, how to make these connections more powerful. So any last inspirations I'd be grateful for.
Sure. No, those are great. And for us and sort of the social and in the social justice work that we're doing here at Northeastern, we think rather expansively about what we consider to be social justice and what we consider to be civil rights. And in one of the areas that has continued to sort of come up in different kinds of ways, and the Boston context in particular around slavery, and having just returned from the College of New Jersey, it's been made clear to me that there's a huge gap in the Northeast, in particular around questions of slavery and how slavery manifested itself, not just in urban contexts, but sort of in rural contexts across the Northeast, and how slavery has not been properly memorialized and remembered and marked. And so I know that there have been efforts at UPenn and other institutions to think about slavery, but there are, I think, still institutions, and this has been an interesting one at the state level, that haven't been sort of grappled with remnants of slavery and indentured servitude at their institutions. So I think there is a narrative there to be told. And so there are institutions that are now trying to figure out what they're going to do about that in particular. So that, I think, is something that has come up on my radar recently at the College of New Jersey and some other sites. And so I think there may be some discussions that need to be had around that in particular. And there are some other more, I think, broader conversations that could be had, I think, and these are sort of more transatlantic kinds of discussions around the Black Power movement and the kinds of connections around civil rights that I think about ways in which we might connect up the Black Power movement with other movements on the African continent. There's plenty of work, obviously, to do in the US, but there are also transnational projects to think about that I think can connect. When we think about social movements, I think we need to not just think US, but we need to perhaps also think about those that connect us in broader ways to the kind of global movements that we understand around freedom and civil rights, and how much was happening between the US and other parts of the world. And we've been talking a bit about Northeastern about some of the connections between the United States and the UK, and some of those sorts of connections there that are important, I think, to also think about and consider. And in my own work on apartheid, how important the UK was and some of those connections, but then thinking about the UK and South Africa, and in other ways, how we think about the transatlantic slave trade. I mean, there's lots of interesting and iterative projects, I think, that can come out of this work, but there's definitely some work to be done on slavery in the Northeast and abolitionists in the Northeast that could be done, that sort of thinks a little bit broader about what we sort of understand to be civil rights.
Fantastic. I can't imagine a more rich, inspirational lunch than you just provided, Professor Nieves. So given that we are just at an hour, this is really, among other things, perfectly timed and incredibly rich. And I'm grateful to all of you who tuned in for your lunchtime and asked great questions and made great comments. This has been a great learning experience for me, and I'm glad that it's recorded so I can go back to it and recover the things that my notes didn't capture. We of course wish you well and Godspeed in all your projects, and look forward to keeping touch. And I hope and trust that there are ways that we can materially partner and keep learning from one another. This has been a great privilege of ours. And we really
Likewise.
thank you for your time, Angel.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. I look forward to partnering up and engaging further. And I look forward to many more conversations. Take care. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.